The sky was covered with thick gray clouds that morning. A soft drizzle had started, but he didn't care. The man drove slowly along the narrow countryside road, the sound of the windshield wipers filling the silence inside his car. He had driven this road every Sunday for the past 2 years, always at the same time, always to the same place. The world called him a billionaire, a man who owned half the city, but at this moment, he was just a lonely father visiting his son's grave. He parked near the small cemetery, took a deep breath, and stepped out of the car. The smell of wet earth filled the air. He carried a small bunch of white lilies, his son's favorite flowers, and walked toward the familiar spot beneath the old oak tree. The ground was soft from the rain, and his shoes sank slightly into the mud with every step. When he reached the grave, he stopped. For a moment, he just stood there in silence, looking at the marble stone with his son's name carved on it. The pain that once crushed him had softened with time, but it was still there like a quiet ache that never went away. He knelt down, placed the flowers carefully, and whispered a few words that only the wind could hear. That's when he noticed it, something small and moving near the side of the grave. At first he thought it was just a stray animal passing by, but when he looked closer, he saw a thin, muddy dog sitting quietly beside the tombstone. Its fur was wet and matted, and it looked weak, almost trembling from the cold. Yet it wasn't begging for food or barking. It just sat there, staring at the grave as if it understood the meaning of the place. He frowned a little, wondering how long the dog had been there. "Where did you come from?" he asked softly, though he didn't expect an answer. The dog lifted its head slightly but didn't move. Its dark eyes met his, and for a second something strange stirred inside him. There was something in that look, something familiar, almost human. He turned away quickly, brushing off the feeling. It was just a stray, after all. He stayed for a while longer, talking to his son in the quiet way he always did. Then, as the rain began to fall harder, he walked back to his car. When he turned to take one last look at the grave, the dog was still there, sitting silently, unmoving as if guarding it. He drove away, but the image stayed in his mind all the way home. That night, while sitting in his large but empty dining room, he couldn't stop thinking about the dog. He had everything a person could dream of: money, cars, houses, but lately, he felt like none of it mattered. The house that once echoed with laughter was now silent. He used to come home to his son running down the hall to greet him. Now there was only stillness. He tried to distract himself with work. He checked emails, read business reports, and signed papers, but his mind kept wandering back to the image of that shivering dog beside the grave. Why was it there? Was it lost, hungry? Why did it look so loyal to a place it shouldn't even know? The next morning, he found himself driving back to the cemetery. He told himself it was just to check, just to see if the animal was still there. When he arrived, the ground was still damp from the night's rain. As he walked toward the grave, he saw the same dog lying on the wet grass. It lifted its head as he approached, but didn't run away. Its tail moved slightly, not wagging with joy, but in a soft, slow motion, like it recognized him. He crouched down, his expensive coat brushing the muddy ground. "You're still here?" he said gently. The dog tilted its head. He noticed its ribs showing under its thin fur. It looked like it hadn't eaten in days. He opened the small bag he brought and took out some bread and leftover chicken. The dog sniffed the air but didn't move closer. Slowly he placed the food near the grave and stepped back. After a few moments, the dog crawled forward and began to eat cautiously. He watched quietly, feeling an unexpected warmth in his chest. He stayed there until the dog finished, then stood up to leave. But as he turned to go, he noticed the dog walk back to the grave and lie down beside it again, curling up as if it belonged there. He didn't know why, but that sight made his throat tighten. Over the next few days, he kept returning. Each time, the dog was there, guarding the grave like a silent protector. Sometimes it slept, sometimes it just sat and stared. The cemetery caretaker told him the dog had been around for quite some time, though no one knew where it came from. "It showed up not long after your boy's funeral," the caretaker said. "Never left since. Strange, huh? Almost like it's waiting for someone." The billionaire stood there quietly, unable to find words. He looked at the dog again. Maybe it was just coincidence, he thought, but something inside him refused to believe it. There was a connection there, something that didn't make sense but felt real. Each visit after that felt different. He began bringing fresh water, proper food, and an old blanket he kept in his car. He talked softly to the dog, even though he knew it couldn't answer. "You don't even know him," he once said, glancing at the grave. "But you stay here every day. Why?" The dog tilted its head as if listening. The caretaker noticed the man's change too. "You seem to like that dog," he said one day. The billionaire smiled faintly. "I don't know if it's that," he replied. "Maybe it's just that he reminds me of someone." He didn't explain further, but deep down he knew what he meant. The dog's quiet loyalty, the way it stayed no matter what. It reminded him of his son's kind heart. His boy had always loved animals, always stopped to feed strays, always believed that love didn't need words. Days turned into weeks. The billionaire found himself looking forward to his visits. He started to stay longer, talking about memories of his son, about how much he missed him, about the things he wished he had said. The dog would listen, lying close, sometimes resting its head on his knee. For the first time in years, he didn't feel completely alone. One afternoon, as the sun began to set, he sat by the grave and watched the orange light fall over the cemetery. The dog lay beside him, its fur cleaner now, its eyes calmer. He reached out and gently patted its head. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" he whispered. The dog looked up at him, and something in that gaze broke through the last wall around his heart. That night, when he got home, he sat in his study looking at an old photo of his son. It was taken at the park a few months before the accident. His son was smiling, holding an ice cream, sunlight catching in his hair. In the background of the photo, almost hidden, was a dog. He looked closer, his breath catching for a moment. The dog in the photo looked very much like the one at the grave. He stared at the picture for a long time, feeling his heart pound. Could it be the same dog? Was it possible that this stray had met his son before? He didn't know what to think, but one thing was certain. He couldn't leave the dog out there any longer. The next day, he went back with a leash and a small collar. When he reached the grave, the dog was waiting just as always. He knelt down and spoke softly. "Come with me. You don't have to stay out here anymore." The dog hesitated at first, then slowly walked toward him. It was a small step, but to the man it felt like a miracle. As they walked toward the car, the dog stopped and looked back at the grave one last time, letting out a quiet whimper. The man gently touched its head. "Don't worry," he said softly. "We'll come back. I promise." That evening, for the first time in a long while, he didn't eat dinner alone. The dog lay near his chair, clean, fed, and warm. When he looked at it, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. It was strange how life worked. He had spent years building an empire, chasing success, trying to fill the emptiness his son's death had left behind. Yet somehow, a homeless dog sitting by a grave had managed to bring a small piece of light back into his dark world. Before going to bed, he whispered quietly to himself, "Maybe some souls are just meant to find each other, no matter how lost they are." And for the first night in 2 years, he slept without pain in his heart. The next morning felt different in his house. For the first time in years, there was another presence moving softly across the polished floors. The dog followed him everywhere, staying close but never being a bother. It seemed to understand things without words, when to sit quietly, when to walk closer, when to simply stay near his feet. He had never kept a pet before. His son used to beg him for a dog, but he always refused, saying he was too busy or that the house wasn't the right place for an animal. Now, looking at the creature sleeping peacefully by the fireplace, he felt a strange guilt rise inside him. Maybe if he had said yes back then, things would have been different. Maybe his son would have been happier. But regrets were useless now. The past could not be changed. He decided to name the dog Buddy. The name came to him naturally one morning as he poured milk into a bowl. "You look like a buddy," he said with a small smile, setting the bowl down. The dog lifted its head, wagged its tail once, and began to drink. It was a small moment, but it warmed his heart in a way he hadn't felt for years. Days started to pass with a new rhythm. Every morning he'd go for a walk in his garden, and Buddy would trot beside him, sniffing flowers and chasing butterflies. At first, the billionaire kept his distance, reminding himself that he didn't have time for distractions. But it didn't last long. Whenever Buddy looked at him with those calm, trusting eyes, he felt something shift inside. In the evenings, he'd sit by the window with a cup of tea, and Buddy would lie near his chair, resting its head on his foot. Sometimes he'd catch himself talking softly about his day, things he hadn't said to anyone in a long time. It felt strange but comforting, like the dog was listening in silence, not judging, not interrupting, just there. One afternoon, while brushing Buddy's fur, he noticed an old collar buried beneath the thick hair. The leather was worn and cracked, and a small rusty tag hung loosely from it. He squinted to read the faded engraving. There was a partial phone number and what looked like a name, but most of it was unreadable. His curiosity grew. Who had owned this dog before? How had it ended up alone at the cemetery? The thought bothered him. He didn't want to imagine Buddy wandering hungry and cold through the streets. There had to be a story behind those tired eyes. That night, he called his assistant and asked her to trace the number. It took a day or two, but eventually she found something. The number was registered to a small orphanage just outside the city. The billionaire felt a strange chill when he heard that. Why would an orphanage be linked to this dog? The next day, he drove there with Buddy sitting quietly in the back seat. The place looked old and worn out. The paint on the gate was peeling, and the playground was empty except for a few rusty swings. Children peeked curiously from the windows as his expensive car pulled up. He got out and asked to meet the caretaker. The caretaker was an elderly woman with kind eyes and tired hands. When she saw the dog beside him, her eyes widened in surprise. "Is that?" she began softly, covering her mouth. "That's Lucky." The billionaire frowned. "Lucky?" "Yes," she said, her voice trembling. "That's what the kids called him. He used to live here." She led him to a small bench under a tree where she began to tell the story. Lucky had belonged to a boy at the orphanage, a quiet child who didn't talk much but always smiled when he was with the dog. The boy had found the puppy on the street and begged to keep it. Though the orphanage couldn't afford pets, the caretaker allowed it, seeing how much happiness it brought. The boy would spend hours playing with the dog outside. He would take it to the park every Sunday, the same park where the billionaire used to bring his son. The caretaker smiled sadly as she spoke. "That boy loved your son," she said gently. "They met at the park many times. They'd share snacks, play football, and laugh like brothers. Your son even brought toys for him once." The billionaire's heart tightened. He remembered his son telling him about a friend from the park, but he had barely listened back then. He was too busy with meetings, business calls, and deadlines. He had thought his son's stories were just about random kids. He never asked who that friend really was. "What happened to the boy?" he asked quietly. The caretaker's eyes filled with sadness. "He fell ill. It happened suddenly. We tried to get help, but..." Her voice faded. "After he passed, the dog stopped eating. It just ran away one night and never came back. We looked everywhere, but it was gone." The billionaire felt his throat tighten. The puzzle pieces began to fit together in his mind. His son and that orphan boy had been friends. They shared moments of kindness he never knew about. And this dog, Buddy, had loved both of them. Maybe after losing the boy, it had gone looking for his son. Maybe it had followed him to the cemetery after the accident and stayed there ever since. He looked down at Buddy, who was sitting calmly by his side, tail wagging slightly as if sensing his thoughts. His eyes filled with tears he didn't try to hide. He had spent years drowning in loneliness, believing that his world ended with his son. But this dog, this creature that had survived heartbreak and loss, had found him, and somehow connected him to the very memories he thought were lost forever. The caretaker smiled gently. "He must really trust you," she said. "He never went near anyone after he left here. Maybe he knows you were important to both of them." When he left the orphanage that day, something inside him felt lighter. The air seemed clearer, the world a little brighter. He looked at Buddy sitting in the passenger seat and whispered, "So you knew him too. You knew my boy." The dog turned and looked at him with quiet understanding. From that day, everything began to change. The billionaire visited the orphanage again, this time bringing toys, clothes, and food for the children. He told no one about it, but it made him feel closer to his son. The kids loved Buddy instantly. He became the center of attention, running and playing with them while the man watched with a smile. One afternoon, one of the children tugged at his sleeve and asked, "Sir, is it true you're a billionaire?" He laughed softly. "I guess so." The boy thought for a moment, then said, "You don't look like one. You smile like a dad." The words caught him off guard. For a moment he couldn't speak. That night when he drove home, he realized that he had spent years surrounded by people but had never really connected with anyone. It took a stray dog and a group of children to remind him what love felt like. Buddy started sleeping in his room after that. The billionaire had a small bed made for him, But most nights, Buddy would curl up at the foot of his bed instead. Sometimes in the middle of the night, he'd wake to find the dog sitting by the window looking outside quietly. "You still miss them, don't you?" he'd whisper. The dog would wag its tail softly and he'd smile. "Me too." He started taking Buddy with him everywhere, to his office, on business trips, even to charity events. People found it odd at first seeing a billionaire with a dog by his side, but he didn't care. Buddy had become his family, and deep down he knew his son would have loved that. Weeks turned into months. The connection between the man and the dog grew stronger each day. They were two souls who had lost the same kind of love, and somehow in each other they found it again. One evening he stood by his son's grave once more, this time with Buddy sitting quietly beside him. The sunset painted the sky in soft orange light. He placed fresh flowers on the stone and whispered, "I met someone who loved you too." He smiled faintly. "And I think you sent him to me." Buddy let out a small bark as if agreeing. The man chuckled softly, wiping his eyes. For the first time since his son's death, his heart didn't feel hollow. It felt full of love, memories, and a strange peace he hadn't known in years. As they walked back toward the car, the man looked down at Buddy and said, "Come on, my friend. We've got more work to do." The dog wagged its tail and trotted beside him, and in that quiet walk under the fading light, it no longer felt like a billionaire and a stray. It felt like a father and a friend, two hearts healing each other step by step. The sound of rain against the window woke him early that morning. The sky was dull and heavy, but inside his house things felt different now. Buddy lay curled up near the fireplace, sleeping peacefully. The man stood quietly, holding a cup of coffee, watching the flames dance in the dim light. He couldn't remember the last time his home had felt this calm. Life had started to find rhythm again. The loneliness that once filled every corner of his mansion was slowly fading. He still missed his son deeply, but now the pain didn't crush him the way it used to. There was something about Buddy's quiet presence that made the world feel less empty. Each morning they'd walk together through the garden. The grass would glisten with dew, and Buddy would chase the birds while he stood by the fountain watching with a soft smile. Sometimes he would talk aloud, telling the dog things he couldn't say to anyone else, and about his work, his memories, his regrets. And even though Buddy never spoke, the man always felt understood. One afternoon, while brushing Buddy's fur, he noticed that the old collar was wearing out completely. The leather had torn near the buckle and the faded metal tag was barely hanging on. He decided to buy a new collar, something simple but strong. When he slipped it around Buddy's neck, the dog wagged his tail as if he knew it was special. But something about the old tag still bothered him. It wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a link to Buddy's past. He decided to clean it carefully to see if any more of the writing could be read. After polishing it gently, a few more letters became clear, just enough to make out part of a name. It wasn't the boy's name, but rather a local park engraved on the back. The next day, curiosity led him there. It was the same park where his son used to play. The place looked quieter now, with only a few children running around. He stood by the swings, remembering the laughter that once echoed here. He could almost see his son running with the same joyful energy as those kids. Buddy, too, seemed to recognize the place. He ran ahead, sniffing the ground, wagging his tail as if he was remembering something, too. A few older men sitting near a bench noticed the dog and smiled. One of them pointed and said, "Hey, that dog looks familiar. Used to come here with those two boys, remember?" The billionaire froze for a moment. "Two boys?" he asked gently. "Yeah," one man said. "One was from that big house across town. Always came in fancy clothes but never acted proud. The other was from the orphanage nearby. They were like brothers. And this dog? He was always running between them." Couldn't separate them even for a minute. The man felt his chest tighten. It was true then. Buddy had been part of his son's little world. He wasn't just some stray that appeared by chance. He had shared memories that even the billionaire himself hadn't been part of. He sat down on the bench feeling a strange mix of sadness and comfort. The park, the laughter, the friendship between two boys, all of it seemed to come alive again through this dog. He gently patted Buddy's head and whispered, "You've carried so much love in you, haven't you?" As the days passed, he found himself thinking more about that orphan boy. The caretaker had said the orphanage was struggling. The man couldn't stop thinking about how much his son had cared for that place and for his friend. So one morning he decided to visit the orphanage again, but this time with a purpose. He drove there with Buddy in the back seat, tail wagging happily. When he arrived, the children ran out to greet the dog like an old friend. Their laughter filled the air, and for a moment he felt something in his heart heal a little more. The caretaker was surprised to see him again. "You came back," she said warmly. He nodded. "I wanted to talk about this place," he replied. "I heard you've been struggling." Her smile faded slightly. "Yes, it's been hard. We lost most of our funding. The roof leaks when it rains, and the kids need new clothes, books, everything. But we do what we can." He walked through the small building, cracked walls, broken furniture, and rooms that smelled faintly of damp wood. The children didn't complain. They laughed and played like it didn't matter. That touched him deeply. His son had always been like that too, finding joy even in the simplest things. He turned to the caretaker and said quietly, "I want to help." She looked surprised. "You've already done so much." He shook his head. "Not enough. My son loved this place. I didn't even know it until recently, but I want to do something that would make him proud." Over the next few months, the orphanage began to change completely. Workers came and went, fixing walls, painting rooms, installing new furniture, and building a new playground outside. The children would gather every day to watch the progress, their excitement growing. The billionaire didn't want his name on anything. He said it should all be in his son's memory. When the work was finally done, he stood quietly near the new sign that read "The Hope Home," in loving memory of a friend who believed in kindness. The caretaker's eyes filled with tears. She whispered, "He would have loved this." The man looked at the building, then down at Buddy, who was lying at his feet. "He already does," he said softly. From then on, the orphanage became part of his life. He visited often, sometimes bringing books, sometimes just to play with the kids. Buddy became everyone's favorite, a living symbol of loyalty and love. The children adored him, and he seemed to love them all the same. But no matter how joyful the days were, Buddy never forgot the grave. Every month the man would take him back there. The dog would sit quietly by the tombstone, tail still, eyes gentle. The billionaire would kneel beside him, whispering to his son as he always did. "He's doing well," he'd say softly. "You'd be proud of him." One day, as they sat there together, the wind blew softly, carrying the scent of flowers from nearby graves. The man closed his eyes and felt the peace that had once been impossible to find. Buddy's presence beside him was steady and comforting. He realized that grief doesn't truly go away. It just finds new ways to live. And sometimes love returns in the most unexpected forms. The bond between him and Buddy grew deeper. They were more than man and pet now. They were two souls connected by the same loss and the same love. Buddy seemed to sense his mood, staying close when he was quiet, nuzzling his hand when he felt low. And the billionaire, who once hid behind walls of wealth and silence, began to open up again to people, to life, and most of all to hope. One evening, as they sat in the garden, the sun slowly setting, he said softly, "You know, Buddy, I used to think money could fix everything. But it can't fix a broken heart. You did that. You reminded me what really matters." The dog looked at him and let out a small, soft bark, almost as if answering, "You weren't broken, just waiting to heal." He smiled. Maybe we both were. As time went on, Buddy became part of everything. His company employees would see him in meetings, lying quietly near his owner's chair. Journalists once tried to ask why a billionaire would keep a stray dog around all the time. The man only smiled and said, "Because he found me when I was the one who was lost." The story spread quietly, inspiring others to adopt, to help, to love, without expecting anything in return. But for him, it wasn't about publicity or image. It was about keeping his son's spirit alive, through kindness, through compassion, through simple acts of care. Every night before bed, he'd look at the photo of his son and whisper, "You're still here, aren't you?" And then he'd glance at Buddy lying nearby, peacefully asleep, and know the answer. The house that once echoed with emptiness now held laughter, warmth, and life again. The silence that once hurt now felt like peace. And the man who once had everything but felt nothing finally found what he had been missing all along. Love that didn't need words, wealth that couldn't be measured in money, and a friendship that was beyond explanation. That night, as he turned off the lights, Buddy lifted his head. wagged his tail once and laid it back down. The man smiled in the dark and whispered, "Good night, my friend," and for the first time, he didn't feel like a man remembering loss. He felt like a father who had been given a second chance at love. You said, the world seemed different now. The man who once lived behind the walls of his mansion was no longer the same. He had learned to smile again, to speak kindly, and to listen when people talked. His life, which used to be filled only with business meetings, luxury, and loneliness, now had meaning. And that meaning had come from an unexpected place. A stray dog who refused to leave a grave. Every morning started with Buddy's gentle bark at his bedroom door. It had become their routine. The billionaire would step outside with a cup of coffee while Buddy ran ahead, chasing birds through the garden. Sometimes he would just stand there and watch, feeling the fresh morning air and realizing how different his days had become. He used to count time by profit, by success, by numbers. Now he counted it in small moments, the way Buddy wagged his tail, the laughter of children at the orphanage, the feeling of peace when he visited his son's grave. These were the things that mattered now. One day, as he sat in his office looking out the window, a thought came to him, a thought that wouldn't leave. He had rebuilt the orphanage, but there were so many other children, so many animals, so many souls who needed care and kindness. His son had loved helping people and animals alike. Maybe this was the path he was meant to continue. He called his assistant and said, "I want to start something new, a foundation in my son's name, something that helps children and animals both." Within weeks, the plan began to take shape. He named it the Hope Foundation, a place dedicated to providing homes, food, and education for children, and shelter and care for abandoned animals. It was his way of giving back to the world that had once taken everything from him. Buddy became the heart of the project. Wherever he went, people smiled. Children loved him instantly. When the new animal shelter opened, Buddy was the first to walk through the gates, tail wagging proudly as if he understood what was happening. The man stood beside him, watching volunteers carry food and blankets into the building. For the first time in years, he felt proud, not of his wealth but of what he was doing with it. News spread quickly. People were curious why a billionaire would invest so much into helping the poor and saving stray animals. When reporters asked, he simply said, "Because love saved me when money couldn't." His words touched hearts everywhere. Donations started coming in, and soon his foundation grew far beyond what he had imagined. Despite all this progress, he never forgot where it all began, the small cemetery under the old oak tree. Every month, without fail, he returned there with Buddy. The dog would sit quietly beside the grave, sometimes resting his head on the tombstone. The man would kneel, place fresh flowers, and whisper to his son about everything that had happened, about the orphanage, the foundation, the laughter that had returned to his life. One evening, as he stood there in the soft glow of sunset, he felt the wind brush gently against his face. The air was still, but it carried a warmth that made him close his eyes. It felt like his son was there, not in body but in spirit. He smiled and whispered, "I hope you're proud of me, my boy." Buddy let out a small bark as if answering, and the man laughed quietly. It was a sound that once seemed impossible for him. Laughter that came from peace, not pain. Back at home, things had changed completely. His mansion, which once felt like a silent museum, now felt alive. The walls that once echoed with emptiness now held laughter and footsteps. The children from the orphanage visited often, filling the halls with joy. He would sit with them in the garden, telling stories about his son, about how kind he was, how he always shared what little he had, how he believed that helping others was the best thing a person could do. Buddy was always part of these moments. The children loved to run around with him, and he never seemed to get tired. Sometimes he'd sit beside the billionaire, resting his head on his lap, eyes filled with that familiar softness that reminded the man of his son. One afternoon, while playing with the children, the man overheard two of them talking. One said, "I want to be rich like him when I grow up." The other replied, "I want to be kind like him." Those words hit him deeply. For years, people had admired his wealth, but now they admired his kindness. That, he thought, was what his son would have wanted. As months went by, the foundation began building small homes for families who had nowhere to go. They also started rescue missions for abandoned dogs and cats. The billionaire visited every site personally, He would kneel beside the animals, feed them, and talk to them softly. People were surprised to see a man of his status doing such things himself. But he didn't care about how it looked. He cared about what it meant. Sometimes he'd stop by the orphanage unannounced, just to spend time with the kids. They would run to him, calling out and hugging him tightly, and every time he felt a warmth inside that money could never buy. But even in all this happiness, there were quiet moments when he'd sit by the window late at night, looking at his son's picture. The ache was still there, but it was softer now, more like a reminder of love than loss. Buddy would lie beside him, his eyes half closed as if keeping watch. One night, as he sat there, he spoke aloud without thinking. "You came to me for a reason, didn't you?" he said softly, looking down at Buddy. "You carried his love when I had nothing left." Buddy opened his eyes, wagged his tail once, and rested his head back on the floor. The man smiled faintly. "Maybe souls do find each other," he whispered. The next day, he decided to do something special. He took Buddy and drove to the orphanage early in the morning. When the children gathered around, he announced that they would build a small park right next to the building, a place where the kids could play and rescued dogs could roam freely. He wanted it to be a place filled with laughter and life. When the park was finished, they held a small ceremony. The children planted flowers and a plaque was placed at the entrance. It read, "For all who loved without expecting anything in return." The man stood there, watching the children play with Buddy under the bright sun, and felt a peace he had never known before. That evening, as he drove home, he realized that this was what healing looked like, not forgetting the past, but turning pain into purpose. He parked the car near the hill overlooking the city. The lights below twinkled like stars and the wind was gentle. Buddy sat beside him, looking out at the view. The man spoke softly, almost to himself. "You know, I used to think my life ended the day I lost him, but maybe that was just the beginning of something I couldn't see yet." He looked down at Buddy and smiled. "You found me when I had nothing left. You reminded me that love doesn't die. It just finds a new way to live." Buddy looked up at him with those same soulful eyes, and for a moment it felt like his son was right there too, through the quiet wind, through the warmth in the air, through the loyal heart of the dog beside him. That night, as they returned home, the man didn't turn on the lights. He just sat quietly in the living room, the sound of rain tapping against the windows. Buddy lay beside him, peaceful as always. He whispered, "Thank you." He wasn't sure if he was thanking the dog, his son, or fate itself, and maybe all three. Outside, the rain kept falling, washing the world clean. Inside, for the first time in a very long time, his heart felt the same way. Washed free of pain, full of love, ready to live again. The years passed softly, like pages turning in a gentle breeze. The man who had once stood broken by his son's grave now walked through life with purpose and peace. His hair had turned silver, his voice slower, but his heart was lighter than it had ever been. The pain of loss was still there, but it no longer hurt the same way. It had become something else, something sacred. Every morning, Buddy still followed him everywhere. Age had caught up with the loyal dog. His steps were slower now and his eyes sometimes tired, but his love had never changed. He still wagged his tail when the man came down the stairs, still waited by the car door, still lay near his master's chair when the evenings grew quiet. Their bond had become something deeper than words. They didn't need to speak to understand each other. The man often said to himself that Buddy was not just a dog, he was a reminder that love never leaves you. It just takes on new shapes. One crisp autumn morning, the man stood on the balcony of his house looking out over the fields behind his estate. The trees had turned golden, and the air smelled of dry leaves and earth. He took a deep breath and smiled. This was his favorite season, the same season his son had loved most. He looked down and saw Buddy lying in the sunlight, eyes half closed. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Everything felt calm, peaceful. But inside, the man felt something else too, a quiet whisper that change was near. That afternoon, he had a meeting at the foundation. The Hope Foundation had grown beyond anything he'd imagined. They now had shelters in different cities, feeding thousands of children and saving countless animals. His son's name had become a symbol of love and kindness. As he spoke to the volunteers, he felt proud but also a little tired. When the meeting ended, one of the children from the orphanage ran up to him. "Sir, the boy said, holding out a drawing. "This is you and Buddy." The man smiled as he looked at the crayon drawing. Two figures standing beside a big tree with the sun shining above. "Thank you," he said softly, taking the paper. "It's beautiful." That night he framed the drawing and placed it on his desk. Then he sat down beside Buddy, who was lying near the fireplace. The dog's breathing was slow and steady. The man ran his hand gently over his fur. "You're getting old, my friend," he whispered. Buddy looked up at him, tail wagging faintly as if to say, "I'm still here." The man smiled and whispered, "So am I." Days passed quietly after that. One morning, as the man prepared to visit the cemetery, Buddy didn't follow him like he usually did. He just lay there, resting his head on his paws, eyes watching softly. The man knelt beside him. "You don't want to come today?" he asked with a smile. Buddy gave a slow wag of his tail but didn't move. The man hesitated, feeling something heavy in his chest, then gently stroked Buddy's head. "All right," he said softly. "You rest. I'll be back soon." When he reached the cemetery, the air was still. The trees around the grave were full of golden leaves. He stood in silence for a long time, thinking of everything that had happened, the pain, the loneliness, the hope, and the love that had found him again. He placed fresh flowers on the grave, then spoke quietly. "I think I finally understand, my boy," he said. "You left me something precious, a reason to live again. You sent Buddy when I needed him the most, and because of you, so many lives have changed." He stayed there until the sun began to set. When he returned home, the house felt strangely quiet. He called out for Buddy, but there was no sound of paws running toward him. His heart sank as he walked through the rooms. Then he saw him, lying near the fireplace, still and peaceful, his head resting on his paws. The man froze. For a moment, the world around him disappeared. He knelt down, touching Buddy gently. There was no movement, no sound, just calm stillness. Tears filled his eyes, but there was no anger, no shouting this time, just a deep ache mixed with gratitude. He whispered, "Thank you, my friend, for everything." He sat beside Buddy for a long time, his hand resting on the dog's fur. The house was silent, but it didn't feel empty. Somehow it felt full of memories, full of love. The next day he buried Buddy under the big oak tree in his garden, the same kind of tree that stood near his son's grave. The children from the orphanage came to help, each of them holding a flower. They didn't cry loudly. They just stood there quietly, understanding in their own way that something special had gone. The man placed a small stone at the spot with the words, "Forever loyal, forever loved." After the burial, he sat under the tree, the afternoon sunlight falling softly through the leaves. One of the children asked him, "Are you sad?" He looked at the boy and smiled faintly. "A little," he said, "but I'm also grateful. He taught me how to love again." In the days that followed, the man spent more time at the foundation. He started a new project called Buddy's Home, a space where children and rescued animals could live together, learning kindness and trust. He said it was Buddy's gift to the world. Soon the place became a beautiful, lively shelter where laughter and barks filled the air. Children who had once been lonely now had friends, both human and furry ones. The man would often visit, sitting on the bench near the gate watching them play, and even though Buddy wasn't there physically, his spirit seemed to live in every corner. One afternoon, as the sun began to set, he felt a light breeze brush against his face. It was the same feeling he had at his son's grave years ago, the same warmth, the same peace. He closed his eyes and whispered, "You're both with me, aren't you?" When he opened them, he saw one of the little dogs from the shelter sitting in front of him. It looked so much like Buddy that for a second, his heart skipped a beat. The puppy tilted its head and wagged its tail gently. The man smiled, leaned forward, and said softly, "Hello there, little one." From that day on, the puppy became part of his life. He didn't call him Buddy, because no one could replace him, but he loved the puppy just the same. Every time he looked into its eyes, he saw a familiar kindness, a reminder that love always finds its way back.